So I'm talking with the violinist Domenic Salerni, who is one-fourth of really one of the most exciting string quartets going right now. That is the Attacca Quartet. They've had a couple of albums that have come out in the past few months, both of them for Sony Classics, and they couldn't be more different from each other. Domenic is here to talk with me about it. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, talk about, first of all, the more recent recording of All Joys, which just came out this month in November. And it mixes music of modern masters like Arvo Pärt with some Renaissance composers like John Doland or Luca Marenzio or other, composers of earlier times. What is the idea behind the album and mixing these genres of music?
Yeah, so we were kind of searching for something that, as you said, would be contrasting with Real Life, which is the album that precedes that, and that of course is arrangements and original electronica music. So as a foil to that album, we thought, what could we do that we could to show kind of not just range of what we can do sonically, but also kind of what we're interested in terms of composers and in terms of linking different eras. If there's variety in Real Life that has to do with a very broad definition of what electronica means, certainly to us, then I think you're going to find a similar range of kind of, it's sort of like a game. Like, when was this piece written? I think there's something kind of beguiling about Arvo Pärt, as you mentioned, because he was explicitly looking at music of earlier eras, particularly the Renaissance and even earlier, early sort of the Gregorian chant and sort of that idea. And we took this kind of playful notion of when was it composed, and sought to figure out, what does this mean in terms of our sound? Can we sort of trick the listener, if you will, into to hearing something and imagining that maybe it was composed yesterday when in fact it was composed 500 years ago. So I think you mentioned two of the Renaissance composers, John Dowland and Luca Marenzio. Marenzio wrote really the first madrigal, and it was his solo e pensoso that we included on this album that was sort of shopped around to places like England. So people like John Dowland and John Bennett, were exposed to his music and said, "Wow, this is super cool. Can we do this, in English?" And so the other sort of the flip side of this album, particularly when it comes to the Renaissance, is that everything that we've done from that time period, which is also vast and really, it's hard to encapsulate, hundreds of years worth of music on one album, but all of it is vocal music. So we were kind of trying to find, notably, except for the Orlando Gibbons, which is actually a consort for 6 viols. So taking sort of that pure tone sound that I know we've been excited about from working with Caroline Shaw for many years, and she brings that kind of that purity of tone, in her vocal work with Roomful of Teeth, but kind of pairing that with what is a consort of viol sound like, and how can this be applied to Arvo Pärt and Philip Glass, is kind of how we were coming to this. And yeah, I mean, we it was really hard to kind of narrow down what pieces we wanted to include on this album, but we kind of came up with something that felt not only symmetrical when we start. Well, I don't want to tell you the order. I'd love for people to kind of figure out, is this from 1590 or 1990?
Right.
So, but yeah, there's something we really ended up really resonating with the pieces that we included on this album. I mean, from Gregorio Allegri to to Gibbons to John Dowland to God, who am I missing? Oh, Jacob Clemens non Papa. That's it. And I don't know if it's apparent upon first listen, but most of the vocal music written in the Renaissance was for 5 or more voices. So we're actually using a lot of the techniques that we discovered with Real Life, post-production, layering, that sort of stuff, and applying it even with this music that can be hundreds of years old. So yeah, at some point, I think there are 9 tracks going on at once.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that, but listening to it, yeah, I can see and hear what you're talking about. You've got some heavy hitters here from the Renaissance. I wonder if there was a discussion about what pieces you were going to include, and then you went to Arvo Pärt and Philip Glass for the modern composers, and those are two, I would say, somewhat different but somewhat similar composers. Certainly Arvo Pärt, as you mentioned, has a real resonance with these other Renaissance pieces. But what's the connection with Philip Glass and this quartet in particular, this Mishima quartet, which was from a film, right? Music you wrote
Exactly.
for a film.
Yeah. Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters. Yeah, there are a lot of ways to unpack this. I think, of course, there's something to be said for the term minimalism, whether it's applied to composers who identify as being minimalist, which Philip Glass does not necessarily. Though, of course, it's a little bit like Debussy and Impressionism. You can't undo these correlations. But I think a more apt term, and I think a term that would help unify both Phil Glass with Arvo Pärt, but also with this music from the Renaissance, is the notion of process music. There's something about imitative counterpoint that you find a lot in the Renaissance that I think really informs these minimalist kind of composers, because you have these processes that kind of just work out and then unfold and kind of flower. And you see that happening subtly, but definitely in Mishima. I like to think of this particular quartet a little bit like one would think of like the suite from a ballet or the suite from an opera. And I think there's something about the emotional journey of the quartet that in fact is very different from how you would interact with the music in the movie. The movie is incredibly visually arresting. And I think maybe the choice of Philip Glass as the film composer for that is by way of perhaps by way of contrast, so, and the other thing too is that the way the movements are presented in Mishima are not terribly in order. So I think you have opening credits and ending credits perhaps, but in the middle, it's sort of like, there's no real narrative happening. The narrative that exists is one more about, this sort of these emotional areas. So something like Bodybuilding, for example, has to do with Mishima kind of preparing for his ultimate demise. I mean, he very famously committed seppuku, publicly. So, and I think, without getting it too much into the history of Mishima, I think there's something about the reverence with which he held Japanese culture that I think resonates with the kind of reverence that, say, Allegri holds, the Tenebrae service. So there's something really kind of, profound about Mishima as a figure, but also about how Philip treated that subject matter in his string quartet. And I think you really sort of hear an empathy, especially, I'm thinking of the closing, Mishima / closing, which is almost as close to a pop tune, as Philip Glass could write. But then when you think about what it's about this self-sacrifice. It's about this kind of, setting one's own person aside in service of a greater ideal. So. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but
well, it does, and it brings to mind just the idea that there is a narrative in all of these pieces of music, and partly because you're working with vocal music originally. There are words attached, but in the case of Philip Glass, there's an entire film story and truth attached to that music as well. So there's a great narrative that runs through all of this, and I love how it's framed by the music of Arvo Pärt, which in itself tells kind of a story. It's left up to the listener really to fill in those details, but
it's the story of a process. It's the story of I think of like prayer beads. You start at one end and you just go, and it kind of lends itself to a meditative state. Which I think also people, describe Philip Glass's music as being very effective in that regard too. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of resonance and overlap when it comes to these composers and how they're approaching, a certain maybe purity of form or harmony or rhythm.
now for something completely different. We go back a few months to your debut album for Sony Classics called Real Life. And the first question I've got for you is, what's the deal with this mannequin head, right? This thing is haunting my dreams because
Oh,
it's the album cover, but it's also, prominent in those videos you have of a couple of songs.
yes, yes.
Yeah,
Well, so
explain this to me.
this is a great. Actually, I really wish that Andrew Yee, our cellist, were here with me to really dive into this. But um, the mannequin was something that we thought about actually kind of from a long time ago. So this was something that kind of coalesced as an image that we thought would be a little bit cheeky. But considering that, of course, the album is called Real Life, so there's not exactly much about a mannequin that's real, and yet it looks like, or it gives the impression of reality. And so we thought that this was a perfect kind of symbol for, well, here you have an acoustic band, you have this string quartet that's been around for 500 years, or not, well, less than that, but 250, 300 years. And here we are going into the studio, this artificial place, and creating something using all of the bells and whistles that modern technology can afford, and hopefully create something that still has an effective, an affective, human capacity to it. And so, we were a little bit on a tight deadline, and Sony was looking for a graphic, and Andrew, who's an incredible graphic artist, an incredible designer, kind of mocked up this mannequin. And there's something kind of wonderfully hopefully playful about the open, the big lips and the open smile, and then we had an artist, wonderful artist, Moises Ramirez, actually render this as a work of art. And then we designed, both the album cover, but also I think we had some singles that featured different versions of the mannequin head. And then Tommy Chavan, who goes by Calipo Spritz, took this mannequin image and really ran with it in a sort of almost dystopian kind of way for some of the visualizers. So yeah, it turned out to be a very fun image. I hope it's haunting you in the best possible way. I hope it's not disturbing you.
Right.
But honestly, there is something perhaps a bit disturbing about it. It's a little bit uncanny valley. And I think if we've ever been in a place the past 18, 20 months, it's been uncanny valley.
Yeah.
I mean, think of all of the Zoom meetings, think of the isolation, the separation. So to have gone into a very isolated place, the recording studio, and to hopefully come out with something that moves people, I think was sort of the idea.
Yeah. Let's talk about the genesis of this album because it's very different from what people would expect. But you came off of that Grammy Award win with Caroline Shaw and the album Orange. And was this your first album after that, or did you do something else in between?
Yeah, it's sort of crazy to think about. We've actually done 4 or 5 recordings over the
Okay.
course of the pandemic. So I think the first one we did is actually volume 2 for Caroline Shaw.
Ah,
So
okay.
that'll come out on None Such, I think, sometime this coming season. So yeah, I think it was maybe the 3rd album that we did. Actually, it's kind of crazy to think about how this works in terms of timeline, because you go in and you have this incredibly intense time in a studio, or in the case of All Joys, in a real concert hall. We all went out to Goshen, Indiana, to record out there. And then for it to be released, months and sometimes years later is kind of crazy. So yeah, but we were all, approached by Sony. We kind of figured all of this out. We wanted to work with them, and they really wanted to do something big and something different as sort of the first statement. And yeah, I mean, it took a lot of soul searching on our parts, and in earlier iterations, I mean, we were talking about doing an Americana album. We were talking about guest artists, and then we realized that the thing that we all shared was this love for electronica in all of its definitions. And I have to credit, Nate is probably the most steeped in this genre. And so, Nate was like, hey, I love these artists. And then we all kind of listened to people that we loved and brought to the table. Sony had some, recommendations as well. So it was really, truly a kind of collaborative effort. And then I, have to shout out Mike League for being able to actually get in touch with some of these people and bring them to the table, so that we were able to, have a back and forth with Daedalus, or have Toki Monster lay her stems on ours, or have someone like Square Pusher just write us a piece, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about how your instruments were used, maybe differently in this recording? I mean, there are extended techniques that people are familiar with. Most of those are, acoustic techniques,
Mm-hmm.
but this is a synthesis, sort of acoustic and electronic music. How did that work physically for you guys as string players?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, every sound that you hear on the album derives from the string quartet. So everything started out acoustically, with one exception. We put an octave pedaler occasionally on the cello, so you got more of the bass kind of register. But there were some acoustic techniques that we used. For example, in Clock Catcher, which is one of the Flying Lotus tunes, Andrew puts a sheet of printer paper over the cello and gets this kind of raspy, kind of distorted sound. So we were sort of finding these playful techniques really in the process of the arranging, but also in the tracking when we were in the studio. We had an electric cello that just sat there. We never ended up using it, you know. So we did some, think of all of the extended techniques that you might be familiar with: Bartok pits, ponticello, scratch tones, harmonics, double stops. I mean, just it was kind of the gamut. But once we tracked everything, we spent another, probably 48 hours, if not more, with Mike League and Nick Hard, over Zoom and using audio movers, basically running it through the mill. So, for example, the drum sort of sound, or the drums, I should say, sound on, say, electric powwow drum is really a combination of all of us slapping our instruments with a kind of group pizzicato. So if you dampen the strings and you kind of go vroom, without making pitch, you get this kind of wonderfully crunchy sound that lends itself to this kind of big, almost disco feel. So then that was assembled, by Nick, who's an incredible audio engineer, sort of in tandem with Mike. And so it was like we would assemble some of these sounds sometimes, and then kind of tweak it and be like, hey, does this slap, as they like to say?
Yeah.
Is this gonna really pop? How's this gonna be tucked into the melodic material? Of course, overdubbing is a big thing. I think in electric power drum, we overdubbed 3 times. So, it's like they're up to 12 strings, or, supposed to sound like a big string section. Yeah, I mean, God, basically any delay or reverb you can think of, it's somewhere there.
It's
Whether
there, yeah.
oh yeah,
Can you guys take this stuff on the road then?
yes,
Yeah.
we actually, so we just performed a live show. We opened up for the band San Fermin at the Brick Celebrate Brooklyn Festival at the end of August, and we had drummer, percussionist, and kind of electronic artist extraordinaire Shayna Dunkelman join us, and she created her own sounds that she programmed, on one of those pads live. And so she was rocking out with us, and that was great. Nate had a whole rack of pedals going on, and he was, slowing down, or putting the pitch down on Andrew's cello, and then we were ratcheting it up for Pilgrim Side-Eye. There's this wonderful kind of introduction that happens, and then throwing some big reverb on us when we were playing Drifting Circles. I mean, so it was really fun to do that, and we're going to do it again at the Big Ears Festival in March. So.
Yeah, great. I wonder, like playing all this different repertoire, does it ever kind of cross-pollinate for you guys? I mean, are you, when you're playing, the Miserere of Allegri, you're thinking square pushers in the back of your head, you got, is it affecting like your musical aesthetic
Absolutely. I think Andrew has said this in the past, but I definitely see this as being the case. Attacca Quartet in an earlier iteration did all 68 Haydn quartets. And so finding a quartet sound through Haydn is one thing, but then finding out that actually lends itself to playing Caroline Shaw, which is in fact the case when it comes to how Attacca approaches her music. It's part and parcel of what we're all about. So, I mean, I'd be hard pressed to say that, Square Pusher influenced Allegri, but I definitely think that, finding that viol sound, going after that Orlando Gibbons rub in the harmonies, definitely influenced how we approached Philip Glass and our repair, especially, anytime there is a dissonance, like how are we approaching that? Is it coming from a vocal standpoint? Is it coming from a kind of pure tone, viol standpoint? But yeah, I think we definitely found that there was cross pollination, certainly with the modern composers and the Renaissance. But yeah, I mean, as far as kind of modern electronic music, and I think we were definitely using the same sort of techniques that we would for Caroline Shaw for things like Daedalus, Square Pusher,
Yeah. Well, you guys are doing great stuff. So much fun to listen to, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about it today. We're going to link to your website, the Attacca Quartet. You've got all kinds of bells and whistles on the website there, and folks can go and watch those creepy videos. They're not creepy, but the mannequin
Try to
head.
keep them light and fun.
Yeah, exactly. So Domenic Salerni, thank you for joining me, talking about these new albums, and we'll get it out there, and hopefully folks will give it all a listen.
Oh, well, thank you so much, and really appreciate having a chance to talk about our new albums.